Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of September 12th, 2021. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Today, we look forward to an engaging conversation on life extension activism, the history of the movement for indefinite life extension, what it has accomplished thus far, and what it is looking to accomplish during this decade. With us, we have a distinguished panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and members. We have our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg. We have our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. We have our Director of Community Resilience, Alexandria Black. We have our Northern California liaison, Celeste Castaldo. Manning our logistics, we have David Shoemaker, our Director of Applied Innovation. And our special guest today is Eric Schulke. Eric Schulke is a life extension activist who has been at work promoting the prospect of indefinite longevity, the feasibility and desirability of indefinite life extension for essentially 2 decades now. And he has been on the board of directors of Longecity. He also is a pivotal figure in MILE, the movement for indefinite life extension. And by way of background, MILE was one of my gateways into more active participation in the life extension movement. The way this happened was that in 2008, I created a video series that you can still find on YouTube called Eliminating Death. And for about 1.5 years, that video series was accumulating views on YouTube. It was essentially my personal perspective as to why it is both feasible and desirable to overcome this scourge of mortality that affects all of us. And then Eric discovered this video series in June of 2010. And he approached me and he essentially said, well, there's this entire movement that is taking shape, and the movement needs volunteers. It needs people like me who can create compelling content, who can write, who can edit other people's writings. And I decided, yes, this was my opportunity to contribute, to make a difference. So I had been collaborating with Eric from time to time ever since that initial communication. I helped him with some of his writings, getting them published on The Rational Argumentator, my online magazine, and we have held some video panel discussions together. And of course, MILE has been crucial in promoting Death is Wrong, my children's book on indefinite life extension, as well as the U.S. Transhumanist Party. So with that as background, I would like to emphasize that Eric has been a pivotal figure in growing the movement to the level it is at right now. And without further ado, I want to turn the discussion over to Eric, because I would like to know from you, Eric, how you got into the movement for indefinite life extension and how that movement has evolved in the course of your experience with it. So, Eric, I believe, yes.
I think that, like a lot of people, sometimes you think about it when you're a kid. Maybe a lot of people do, I don't know, but only some people seem to take it further. I always thought death was wrong when I was a kid too, I guess. And then when I was older, I tried to think of what I wanted to do with my life, and I realized there's too many things, and I didn't want to choose, some of the things on the list. But I forced myself to be honest, like, what do I honestly want? And it took a few months, but I realized that I want all the things that I want, not just some of them. And to do that, you need time. So I started thinking, how do you get more time? You gotta stop death. Back in the day, I didn't call it life extension. I called it we should cure death. So I tried talking to people about it in those terms, but there was really nobody around, back in 2000. So it was just me for years and years. And then, kind of like you were saying, a guy from the Immortality Institute came and found me. And then I went there and started working. And, so that kind of sets it up for, my vision of what I see in numbers of growth. Because back in 2000, it seemed to me like there was no life extension. So I'm sure, like if I would have guessed at that time, I probably would have said, and in retrospect, there was probably dozens of committed life extensions, but they were hard to find. And then by 2004 or so, when I was at the Immortality Institute, I'm pretty sure the initial membership numbers when I first got there was around 500. And I've always kind of used that as a gauge. I mean, I don't know if that's how exact that number is overall with all the other organizations that were around, but there weren't many. Maybe the Better Humans or Extra Institute or something had a couple hundred people or something, but and it was always so in the beginning, as you know, I guess it was a lot much more difficult work to get anything done. We were basically just spinning our wheels and being frustrated that nobody would listen. And but, it was a time for figuring out what our argument was, and in the process attracting a broader and broader base of committed supporters. Even if you can only increase your committed supporters from 500 to 900, that's a big big achievement at a time like that in a cause like this. So we would aim for stuff like that, and it grew over the years. And around 2014 I remember as kind of like the next up period for whatever reasons. And around that time, I tried again to assess how many people I thought were in the cause, and using various indicators and stuff. It's hard to say how accurate it is, but it seemed to me like there was approaching. I thought we could almost say, hey, we got probably 100,000 supporters that think about this, and they might not be committed, but they're close to it. You could give them a little push, and they would probably come this way. That kind of supporter. And at that time, when I was thinking about that, it kind of makes you realize that it seemed like all that little stuff from earlier, 2003 to 2014, really did add up. It's hard to say, but it was basically just a collection of hundreds of people like us doing small things that, like I always tell people, I would rather have 10,000 $1 donations than one $10,000 donation, because it gets 10,000 people to take a little step in the right direction. With all those little things and all those little steps, I think we did that led to the bigger thing, that led to the $10,000 donations and so forth.
Yes, and indeed right now, the Facebook page for MILE, the Movement for Indefinite Life Extension, has about 75,000 likes on it, which is impressive given what we estimate the size of our movement to be. So would you say that you were able to reach essentially all of the committed life extensionists in the world, or are there still other people who would sympathize with us if only they received our message?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I don't think that page captured nearly as much as it should have. A lot of it was through ads. And even if you highly target your ads in Facebook, for some reason they don't capture those people very well. And but it always seems like we're running out of people to convert. sort of, for some reason. But I think every time we push ahead a little bit more, we think we're gobbling up that market. But every time we push ahead a little bit more, we get more peripheral onlookers and whatnot that are starting to drift this way, and then it makes it easier to open up that next. Plus, young people are coming of age every year, and there's millions of kids are, going from 10 years old to 20 years old and trying to figure out what they want to do in life. And we've always got to be there to try to give them a compelling narrative to this direction in life.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Now, do you think that the formation of the Transhumanist Party in 2014 and Zoltan Istvan's Immortality Bus campaign, and then the subsequent activism that we have done, has helped to grow the movement and attract new people to it?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. It's not really, of course, the movement for indefinite life extension, which is, just a loose coalition of all the people, projects, and organizations that work directly and indirectly towards the goal of life extension. So, that was not quite the point. So, I mean, it certainly wasn't the movement for indefinite life extension doing all that stuff. And then, Zoltan and you were a big part of that. And then, 2014, like I said, made me think around 100,000 people. But then the Transhumanist Party and all the stuff Zoltan was doing, and all of the, Aubrey's media presence continued to get bigger. And it seems like pretty much those three factors that drove it from 100,000 to whatever it is now. And, it's hard to say, but it must be millions by now.
And this is an interesting question. I agree with you that the 75,000 likes for the Mile Facebook page don't capture the entirety of our movement. And I have been asked from time to time, how many transhumanists are there in the world? And that's quite a difficult question to answer, because I can tell people how many members there are of the US Transhumanist Party. There are about 3,500. I can tell people this particular page has a certain number of likes. This particular group has a certain number of members on Facebook. This particular account has a certain number of Twitter followers. But when you add all of those up, you have to account for the overlap as well, because many people who are in our movement like all of those pages and are members of many of those groups. So do you have any thoughts about how we could go about reliably estimating the number of life extension supporters or transhumanists in the world without engaging in wishful thinking? So I think we can all say, well, a lot of people use technology, they're early adopters of emerging technologies, they seem to have favorable attitudes, but that's a bit of a different question than how many people explicitly identify as being for indefinite life extension. So do you have any thoughts about how we could gauge that and get an estimate that is at least roughly accurate?
No, not really. Yeah, I mean, I thought of that same thing before, and it's just really difficult to do. I suppose you could just take all the major places with significant membership, and put them in some kind of program where you can cross-reference all their names. Some people spell their names different or have aliases or whatever, but it might crunch it down in some way.
Yes, it's definitely an interesting avenue to pursue. We would need a lot of data entry work to make that happen, but I think it could be done with enough manpower or a very good algorithm that's able to capture all of that information and then cross-reference it and remove the duplicates. Now, we have a comment from Scott in the YouTube chat who says there are billions who will join this movement once it becomes a realistic possibility. And I think by it, he means indefinite life extension. So Aubrey de Grey has spoken about this. He sees an inflection point on the horizon during the course of this decade when, to many people, the prospect of longevity escape velocity will become apparent as a possibility in their lifetimes. And then the attitude of the public, in Aubrey's view, will shift essentially overnight from kind of dismissing this prospect to clamoring for it and insisting that politicians, scientists, the medical system deliver on it even before the technologies actually become available. So do you think that is a realistic outcome to hope for this decade?
Yeah, that was actually another part of the process of what I was going to say. Now that you remind me, is that I was estimating earlier today what I thought it might be. And on the low end, some low millions, but on the high end, I thought maybe 20 million people have gotten this in their head now. And I read the tipping point years ago, and part of it that sticks in my mind is how they always say there's a 20-80 rule. Once you reach 20%, it's likely to tip over into the rest of the market. I used to know more about it, but it kind of vaguely sticks with me. But it made sense to me then, and it still kind of makes sense to me now. In 20 million or so, I think we're in the zone to where the next stage is going to be so big that it's going to become a mainstream thing, basically, like you and Aubrey are saying. So I think we are right there on the cusp, which is really it's an exciting thing to say.
Yes, indeed. I think if we get another order of magnitude of explicit supporters, then this will become a major public policy issue. It will become a major topic of discussion in the media and in everyday conversations among people. Now, Ben Ballweg, in our internal chat, states that Pew's 2014 survey might be a good start. And I will ask Ben to elaborate on his comment. And in the meantime, Eric, if I could ask you to adjust some of your microphone settings to see if we could get a louder and clearer volume from you when you speak next. But let's turn it over to Ben so that he can provide some comments about the Pew survey.
So back in, it was either 2013 or 2014, Pew had a survey. I don't have it pulled up right now, but they surveyed the general population for their feelings about radical life extension. I can't remember if there was something in there about people believing that it was a possibility. I just remember it asking more, would they want it if it was possible? But I just kind of wondered if from their survey, if they would be able to, if there'd be some data point in there that would be indicative in 2013 or 2014 of how many Americans in general, as a percentage, think that such extension is possible. And, 8 years later, 7 years later, it might be time for having another one of those surveys to get a better read. But I'm curious to check it out myself now and see if there's anything in there. So.
Yes, and I posted a link in the YouTube chat to a Pew report from July 2016, which seems to be based on this survey. And it found that larger proportions of the American population were worried rather than enthusiastic about certain potential human enhancements, including gene editing giving babies a much reduced disease risk, brain chip implants for much improved cognitive abilities, and synthetic blood for much improved physical abilities. So this is a Pew survey about emerging technologies that transhumanists do support and that could contribute to life extension, even though it doesn't specifically comment on increasing lifespan. But there is cause for concern in the survey that large portions of the American public are still wary of these technologies for whatever reason, but it would be interesting to revisit these questions 5 years hence and see whether those attitudes have changed. Now, Eric, in your experience over the time that you've been involved with the movement for indefinite life extension, have typical public reactions that you encounter changed in significant ways? Compare how you were received at the start of your activism efforts and how those same ideas, that same advocacy is received today.
Well, first a comment on that Pew poll. I think I wrote something about it before. I think I just broke it down in a paper or something. I forget, but yeah, there was not a lot of terribly positive stats in there, but there was some that it seemed like some like papers that were painting it in like a negative light, saying that this is bad news, that people aren't coming around. I read through it and I was like, I wonder if that's true. There were some points that seemed very positive too. I forget exactly what they were. Like I think like 6% of people said they would be willing to live to 120 or unlimited or something like that. I don't know. I forget. But it seemed like there was some positives, and it seemed like it didn't capture the entirety of the situation, because like you're saying, they didn't really take a life extension lean at all. I mean, just vaguely. You know? And as to how people respond to that, well, first of all, I mean, like, you know, people in the regular life, I think it's a good idea to just not really talk to them unless you're very comfortable and they seem fairly amicable or something like that. But most of the outreach, I think, works well in various contexts. I wrote a whole guide about it. Like I think that what a lot of people see as a brick wall, and what I used to see as a brick wall, like in the beginning days of the Immortality Institute, I remember it was a regular discussion. Everybody would just be like, well, no matter what we say, it doesn't matter because nobody cares. People just laugh. People just think it's stupid. And that is how it seemed. But that's just because we didn't figure out the nuances, the psychology of it all. And you gotta, you know, like, I don't know, there's ways to do it now. And whereas back in the day, you would mention it and people would always be confused about what you were talking about. Nowadays, there's a good chance that you can just approach a stranger. I don't know what it is, maybe 1 in 10 or 50 or something, and they've heard of this before. So, you know, which is great. It makes it a lot easier. You know? And so, because we've evolved our strategies for getting through to people, and because people are hearing about it more, I think our ability to convince a given demographic has increased.
Yes, and that has been my impression as well. There is greater awareness of the prospect of indefinite life extension, and in casual conversation, in ordinary settings, people are more likely to be receptive and at least mildly enthusiastic. There's still skepticism from some people, certainly, but the Overton window has shifted enough that the idea is not out of the question for many people. So even those who are skeptical, their reservations will be more along the lines of the overpopulation argument or concerns about resource depletion or playing God. They don't say, this is so ridiculous, it's not even worth considering. So it's a shift in this sequence from first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and those two are not really happening anymore. Then they fight you, which is starting to happen, and then you win. And hopefully we will win in convincing the public that indefinite life extension is both feasible and desirable. Now, Ben did provide a link to the Pew survey that was published in August of 2013. And the headline of that one is Living to 120 and Beyond, Americans' Views on Aging, Medical Advances, and Radical Life Extension. And then this survey does explicitly ask who wants to live decades longer. And it provides the percentage of US adults saying that they personally and most people would or would not want medical treatments that slow the aging process and allow the average person to live decades longer to at least 120 years. And it's interesting because the respondents to the survey stated that they personally, 56% of them stated that they personally would not want to live to 120 years, but 38% stated that they would want to live to 120 years, which is a substantial portion of the population. 38% is nothing to scoff at, but their perception of what most people would or would not want was even more interesting, because 27% said that most people would not want to live decades longer. 68% said that most people would want to live decades longer. So even a lot of people who stated that they personally would not want to live decades longer believed that most people would want to live decades longer. And I think there's a certain kind of performative humility at play here. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I think some people may consider it perhaps too egotistical, too self-serving to say that they personally want to live longer, but they have no trouble attributing those motives to others. And in part, the statement that they would not want to live longer is a kind of virtue signaling on their part. They may be saying, oh, I'm content with my life. I'm not important enough that I would want to live that much longer, but perhaps other people do, and I recognize that other people do, but for me, this is okay. And I don't know how genuine that sentiment is if they actually were faced with that kind of choice, if they could get a treatment that cured them of one of the diseases of aging or rejuvenated their cells a bit, especially given that at no point in time is somebody going to be faced with an immortality pill. These are going to be incremental treatments that are going to alleviate certain conditions, rejuvenate the body to an earlier stage, address some aspects of biological aging, but one will not be immortal just by taking recourse to those treatments. So perhaps in practice, even many of those people are going to go into the clinic once those treatments become available and avail themselves of them, not even thinking about the life extension effects, but indeed achieving longer lifespans. So Eric, do you agree with that observation that perhaps even the people who express reluctance in these kinds of surveys are actually going to come along and embrace those technologies once they are available to them?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they just they don't want to be the ones to look weird first, you know. So they don't want to say they would consider it. So they just virtue signal. And you know, it reminds me of questions I like to try to trap those people on sometimes. You know, I say, well, so let's just say hypothetically somebody put a pill in your mashed potatoes, and now you're living that makes you live, you know, indefinitely. Now what are you gonna do? Are you gonna just choose, you know, the average age of your grandparents and then kill yourself on that day? You know, aren't you? And on the other side of the story, it's like, why wouldn't you want life extension? Because you can still end your life anytime you choose to. You're just giving yourself more freedom. You know, why would you want less freedom over the outcome of your own life? You know? I don't know. You know, there's tons of arguments. And it seems like the arguments can't lose once they get into a mainstream echo chamber. You know, it's like we're on the right side. People can be convinced of, people are convinced of ridiculous things on a regular basis, as well as good things. And this is one of the best things. So it would be very ironic if one of the best things that ever happened to humanity just couldn't get through to them, but every other weird thing could. You know? And it will eventually happen. It's just a matter of hammering away at those skeptics and fence sitters. And a lot of people just aren't paying attention. A lot of people have just never had anybody prompt them to think about this. I mean, it is a big world. You could hypothetically go a whole lifetime without ever considering your own mortality in a serious way.
Mhm. Yes, indeed. And I do think for many people who are skeptical or say they wouldn't themselves take advantage of those treatments, indeed, they have not thought through this thoroughly enough. They may be making these kinds of offhand arguments because they don't really feel like this is a realistic possibility yet. And they're kind of trying to say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't want this anyway. But if it became a realistic possibility, they may think more thoroughly about it and they may come to different conclusions. It's interesting, Celeste Castaldo states in our internal chat that large portions of the American public condemned open heart surgery when American surgeons first started performing this life-saving procedure. And this wasn't too long ago. This was in the 1950s. So, Celeste, if you have any thoughts on what got the American public to change its view of open heart surgery, because right now you don't see anybody opposed to it. You don't see even the most fundamentalist religious groups. You don't see the back to nature people saying, oh, open heart surgery is a bad thing, we need to reject it. So what changed?
Wow. Well, I'm really not sure what changed, other than the fact, I guess, probably the witnessing of those who had received the surgeries and whose lives were saved must have been, a huge portion of what changed their minds. Although I believe, like, what I'd heard about the kind of the fear that a lot of the Americans were having was that it being the heart was something sacred, that it just was beyond their comprehension that in medicine you would even dare touch the heart, or they were kind of equating it with their soul or something along those lines, to where it was just beyond their comprehension that it could save their life and be a great medical practice. And so, but I think it must have just been seeing the people's lives saved that changed their minds.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I wonder about something about that, because I had heard that they make you really cold and slow down the metabolism, and that for a little while they're operating on the heart, you're kind of technically dead. And I'm wondering if that's what they were worried about, that, you're kind of technically dead for a while if your heart ain't beating, and then worried about, like Gennady says, about this continuity of, yourself. And then I guess maybe just enough people must have came back all right, but I wonder if that's what it was. I don't. Back to you, Gennady.
Yes, well, it's interesting because, yes, there have been some medical procedures that necessitated reducing the temperature of the body to give surgeons time to operate on the tissues and not have the blood get in the way, essentially. But I don't know enough about open heart surgery itself to say whether or not it uses that technique in all situations. I do want to bring up a set of comments made by Great Point. And Great Point essentially says that in getting someone to accept indefinite life extension, potentially one is asking someone to step outside their psychological worldview. And he also says, quote, I find if you can make some feel something in their body and they get a good feeling, they will accept the idea. So perhaps the people who go through some of the rejuvenation treatments, if they have a positive experience with them, if they can report that they feel younger, they feel more energetic, they feel less pain, they don't feel any of the inhibitions that come with disease or frailty, then perhaps a lot of people will say, well, we want the same thing. So that's interesting to consider as well. But I would like to get some of the other panelists' thoughts on what could shift the attitudes of the public toward the prospect of life extension so that people who were previously skeptical might embrace it. And let's hear what Art Ramon thinks about that.
Yeah, I think we could have a shift because the military is actually doing research into anti-aging with soldiers. And once you have Navy SEALs and special forces and pilots who the government has invested in them, a lot to train them, and they want to make sure they get their return on investment. So we're going to have this as an example, is all these people who are longer lived now, ex-pilots, special forces, and they will be the example. And I think when we start seeing true life examples, we're going to have a lot more acceptance for the populace.
Mm-hmm. And you make a good point. I do know that the military has been exploring ways to make soldiers more resilient, more resistant to the various perils that can be found on the battlefield, less likely to be exhausted. And there have been some forays into longevity research as well, though, of course, not being an insider, I don't know how far along that research actually is. But I think it's a good idea to pursue it. People in the military are risking their lives in a considerable way. And the prospect of significantly extending their lives would be quite an appropriate reward for their service and for the risk that they're taking on. And indeed, once they return to the civilian population, a lot of people are going to see those individuals as examples of what could be accomplished. Now, John H. in the YouTube chat on the subject of what changed the perception of open heart surgery says, success changed it. Nothing succeeds like success. So it's interesting to get that perspective. By that perspective, the technologies should be explored and refined further. And once they get to a certain point where there are widespread successes, the public will come on board. The key is, how do we handle that interim period when the technologies are still not in the condition that they would demonstrably succeed in extending human lifespan, but they're getting there. They just need time, they need resources, and they need enough public support to get them to the next level. So this transitional period is the most difficult because it will make the difference between whether or not those technologies arrive and then how quickly they will arrive. Will they arrive in time to save the current generation that is over 60, for instance? And I would be interested in other panelists' thoughts on this question. Let's go to Alexandria Black. What are your thoughts about how we can handle this transitional period, get more acceptance for life extension technologies and research, at least enough to get them to the next stage where they are producing demonstrable results?
Through a series of victories, like you just said, through our advocacy. I was just trying to figure out how long I've known Eric on Facebook. I was just thinking in that. I didn't quite get there. 7 years or something like that. But anyway, Eric, can you please work on your microphone? It's a little struggle to hear you still. Thank you.
Yes. And while Eric works on his microphone, I'll relate another comment from Great Point, who says, if you can convey the feeling in people's imagination, they will be more open to thinking and considering it with logic. He believes that people are controlled by instincts more so than emotions and more so than logic and reason. And we did have quite a productive virtual Enlightenment Salon on this very subject with Gary Abramson, who spoke of the importance of inspiration in getting people to recognize the possibilities of this movement. So I will provide a link to that virtual Enlightenment Salon in the YouTube chat. Meanwhile, Eric, I would like your thoughts on what are some of the effective techniques for inspiring people to really invest themselves in this possibility, to see all of the benefits that can come from living longer and having the opportunities that come along with that.
Well, I mean, I guess that reminds me of three main points I try to stick to with moving for indefinite life extension stuff, which is, you know, it seems that we just need to pound away at the message of keep on explaining and prompting people to tell us why they think that life is desirable. Because even though it seems like it shouldn't be that difficult of a thing to think of, you know, a lot of people really aren't thinking about how awesome life is. In fact, you know, as we all know, most people are just wallowing around in I like the word virtue signal too, kind of a virtue signaling negative trance, you know, it's like cool to be negative, you know, and they're not really thinking about why this awesome chance to be alive is so great and all the opportunities that it presents and stuff. You know, they're only thinking in one track things like the life in front of them. They're not looking at the life all around them, at the end of their life, all the things they can't do. And that may, you know, like I said, I have a guide that has a lot of interesting things for getting through to people that I've collected over the years. But one that I think is the most important, and that goes along with this, is that it seems like that the way to convince most people, if you really want to boil it down, is that they just need to hear about it from more than one source that they view as at least fairly credible. Well, not more than one. They have to hear about it from a variety of sources before they're going to start to consider it. And they can't have heard about it like 10 years ago and then forgot about it. You know, it's got to be like, they got to know that they've been hearing about this, you know. And I think it just kind of comes down to that. I mean, most people are just kind of, even myself, you know, if I hear about the new zoo 5 times, you know, maybe I'm going to go to the new zoo, you know, or I'm going to start thinking about stuff or whatever, you know. And
Yes.
I mean, you know, the research success, I always used to say it before, back in the day when it was mostly just grassroots and the Methuselah Foundation, I would answer this question by saying it seems mostly like we can have robust mouse rejuvenation that can take us there, which is basically saying successful science is going to convert a lot of people in big swaths. But we can't depend on that, because even though they are coming in at a fairly steady trickle, they're not huge breakthroughs, and we don't know if any huge breakthroughs are going to get here in the next 10 or 20 years. We can't depend on that. So in the meantime, we have to grow the grassroots. But the grassroots is basically just about feeding people power and resources to the research anyway. We want more research to, you know, have a chance to fail or make a small breakthrough or a large breakthrough. Like any of those three things are progress.
Yes, and those are important points. The value of repetition, especially enabling people to hear the same idea multiple times from different sources and perhaps in slightly different ways, but enough for them to see that this is indeed an idea within the public discourse and a prospect that is memorable in some way, worth looking into. Then you discussed the early efforts in robust mouse rejuvenation, and of course the Methuselah Foundation had the Methuselah Mouse Prize in the 2000s. Interestingly enough, we had a virtual Enlightenment Salon this past Monday on Labor Day with David Goebel of the Methuselah Foundation. And we spoke about the Methuselah Mouse Prize. And he related his view that the intent of the Methuselah Mouse Prize was to attract public awareness to this prospect of indefinite longevity and get the investment in this field to the next level so that there could be startups working on particular degenerative diseases and rejuvenation approaches, and so that there would be more willingness to invest because this mouse rejuvenation serves as a proof of concept. It's not necessarily the case that the same life extending or age reversing methods that work in mice will work in humans. Indeed, a lot of the treatments that work in mice end up failing to work in humans. However, it is a proof of concept that it's feasible to rejuvenate an organism, and then people will ask, well, why not humans? And so during the past decade, the Methuselah Foundation has gone on to the next stage of directly investing in companies that make some of these rejuvenation possibilities available directly to humans without first testing them in animal models. So that's definitely a promising development. It seems like we're at that next stage of human research. Of course, we've had gene therapy trials. We've had some gene therapies approved by the FDA. We've had Liz Parrish famously get a combination gene therapy performed on herself, and at the very least, it didn't harm her. But anecdotally, it seems like it helped her in certain ways, and she even looks younger now than she did when I saw her in 2016. So all of these are promising signs. Now, Alexandria does raise a concern. She says physical health alone isn't enough. We need economic and social health too. And to her, it seems all such pillars are crumbling. Alexandria, would you like to expand on that?
Sure. I hear people say, I wouldn't want to live under the current conditions. Life sucks. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. Now, how are we going to convince people that living longer is such a great idea before we've tackled all these other problems of, world economic collapse and all the existential risk we face right now? So, can you paint a rosier for me?
Yes, and indeed, this is a difficult time for many people, and I don't want to discount that in the least. There's a global pandemic happening. A lot of people's economic prospects have been derailed by that pandemic. There is unprecedented polarization in American politics, but also elsewhere in the world. And a lot of people have to live in fear of crime, violence, looting, rioting, and social disintegration. A lot of the previous non-governmental institutions that provided opportunities to people and held society together with some degree of cohesion are fraying or disintegrating completely. And for many people, these immediate concerns seem to outweigh the prospect of dramatic improvements in the future. It is my view, however, that only transhumanism really offers a way out of this predicament by dramatically shifting the terms of the conversation. So if people just focus on the day-to-day problems, they'll be treading water, metaphorically. At best, they'll be staying in place. But we need to advance our technological capabilities to really solve a lot of these pervasive problems and make sure that better healthcare, greater material abundance, better economic opportunity is available to as many people as possible. We can't do that without major investments in technological progress and high-tech infrastructure as well. But Eric, what are your thoughts on that? How do we overcome the reservations, especially of people who are struggling right now? Because those are certainly people whom we would want to have access to life extension technologies as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've got arguments, but that's one of the things that I'm still in the process of trying to put together. And I mean, the argument is there. It's just hard to make it coherent, digestible to the people at the right time in their lives. It's like everything is getting better in the world overall, but you can't tell it to somebody who's homeless, suddenly homeless or whatever. Doesn't seem like that to them, but and the media, the mainstream news just won't let people forget about every negative thing. And like I told somebody the other day, I said to somebody, everything seems negative to you because they said, why does the world seem so negative or something? I said, because you watch mainstream news. And they said, well, what do you watch that? I said, I tried to keep up with the cutting edge frontiers of humanity across the board. When you're busy focusing on where life extension is going, where 3D printing is going. 3D printing, is not just for baubles and toys. It's for houses and things that help people's lives. And as these things develop and you're focusing on them, it seems so difficult to understand their position. It's like the saying, some people see a problem for every solution, and some people see a solution for every problem.
Yes, and that's a great point. Does somebody have a mindset that's focused on the problems or focused on the solutions to the problems? And if one is focused on the solutions, clearly that's not to discount the problems. The problems exist, they're very real, they need to be overcome, but there are good proposals out there for overcoming them. And also, there are certain fallacies that some people commit when they adopt a mindset of despair about the future or the prospect of living longer. So Jason points out in our internal chat that for some people, living longer means being old and in pain, and they equate greater longevity with greater frailty. However, saying that getting younger is the goal, in Jason's view, might sound better than just living longer. This is the so-called Tithonus error. So Tithonus was a mythical Greek figure who was given indefinite longevity without the aging process being stopped. So he essentially, according to the myth, just became frailer and frailer with time. And this is somehow still a common association in the minds of many people. They think that if they live to be 150, they'll be more decrepit than they would have been at 90 or 100. But that's really biologically impossible, because it is the decrepitude itself that makes one so susceptible to disease that over the course of a few decades of being in a frail state, from a probabilistic standpoint, one is virtually certain to die. The only way to avert that is to become biologically younger. So in my communications on indefinite longevity, I always point this out. I say, this isn't about being frail for a longer period of time. This is about rejuvenating the organism so that you can be as biologically young as you are, at the very least in middle age, but eventually people will be biologically young like people in their 20s are today, and perhaps even younger in certain senses, not in terms of being a kid, but in terms of not having the accumulated damage in their cells that even typical 20-year-olds have today from the time of their birth. So that kind of prospect, hopefully, would appeal to more people, at least if they think about it from the standpoint of how they would like to feel on a day-to-day basis. Scott, hey, yes, go ahead.
What was that guy's name again? I had never heard of this Greek myth that you were talking about. but it
It's
sounds really interesting.
Tithonus, and I'll include a link to Tithonus in our chat shortly. But first, I want to bring up a comment from Scott, who says, we need a conscious societal effort to increase the rate of technological progress and some effort into also helping people to prepare for those changes so that they're less likely to turn against it. And I agree with that completely. Luis Arroyo writes, if you want to inspire people to want to live longer, give access to life extension technology and therapies to everybody who wants it, then allow people to come to their own voluntary conclusion. And I agree that would be a desirable outcome. Of course, initially there could be some constraints on the ability to give access to those treatments to everybody just because of the cost of the initial generation of the treatments. Somebody has to be the first experimental test subject, and also the need to work out the bugs, so to speak. So the first generation of treatments may have some uncertain side effects, for instance, and it may be necessary to test those in the first group of patients before those treatments can be spread. But I agree, I want them to spread as fast as possible, and the sooner that happens, the better. The life extension researchers with whom I have spoken on this are of the same mindset. Now, one example is Bill Andrews, who is working on developing gene therapies for degenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease. And he pointed out that the cost of the first gene therapy is going to be in the millions of dollars just because the production process is so resource intensive. But he would want the cost to come down sufficiently that it could be made available for free. If he could achieve that, he would. But it's going to take a few generations of those treatments, not generations in terms of human lifetimes, but iterations upon the technology to get it to that point. Aubrey de Grey has made the point that once the technology becomes sufficiently affordable, governments and pension systems are hopefully going to see it as a no-brainer to offer those treatments to people for free or close to free, because that's going to cost a lot less than paying for sick care or paying for old age pensions. Now, again, we need the technology to advance to a certain level before that can happen. And the question of what happens in the interim is an important question. I would say we need to allow all development, all clinical trials, no matter how expensive, to proceed. And we need to allow that to happen because that accelerates the time frame for those treatments to ultimately become affordable enough so that they can be distributed to as many people as possible. And then I'd like to also point out an observation from Mike Lazine, who says, quote, "I think it is funny that some of the same people who don't want immortality are fans of supernatural entertainment that has vampires and so on that are immortal. And indeed, as I understand it, the vampires are often portrayed sympathetically within those shows and books. So clearly, at least within a fictional context, a lot of people don't really have that much of a problem with individuals who have much greater than typical longevity. So now I am going to turn this over to Ben Ballweg for his thoughts about how we can get more of the public to be on board with indefinite life extension during this transitional period.
That is the $1 million question. I maybe will turn this right around to Eric. And so, Eric, I have a question of, I wonder what science you have seen in the last, I don't want to say 20 years, but maybe like the three scientific advances we've learned about slowing down or fixing aging or something that have convinced you that this is a viable path for humanity and that might be usable on the public to convince them as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's like I was saying before. There's three main points that I like to focus on. Telling people why life is great. The second one is trying to explain to people why they should think that bringing about life extension is unlimited lifespan is feasible. Like, why should they think that biology can even be worked with in that way? And as for life extension advancements, I mean, there's small research successes trickling in here and there, but I don't really see a lot of the other things as major steps. I mean, they're good, and I mean, they're beneficial and good for publicity and good for people and those companies and everything. But the main reason why I would say in that way is that, you know, there's lots of, you know, what do you call it, proofs of concept and things like we need to do, like, especially, like, I'm heavily SENS focused. You know, I think SENS is probably the main path that will take us there, even though, you know, there's some other paths that could too. But in SENS, you know, especially in ending aging, you know, it gives you some really good examples of proofs of concept of things that they're trying to do that have already happened. You know, like they want to migrate mitochondrial genes into the nucleus. And I thought that was, you know, one of the most difficult ones. But when I was reading the book, I'm like, wow, he gives examples of how this has already been accomplished to limited extent. I mean, they weren't wildly successful with it, but they've proven that it's not impossible to work with this. You know, I think it's those kind of breakthroughs that we have to focus on, trying to convince people that stopping aging isn't magic. You know, for some reason, they think it's magic.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that response. And I agree that the SENS approach, strategies for engineered negligible senescence, as laid out by Aubrey de Grey and as championed by him over the course of more than 2 decades now, is one of the most promising approaches. It definitely convinced me in 2004 that reversing biological aging and reaching indefinite lifespans would be possible for people in our generation, that this wasn't just a remote science fiction prospect, because the SENS approach doesn't require a comprehensive understanding of human metabolism or slowing down the metabolism to the point that the aging-related damage doesn't accumulate as quickly. What SENS is an engineering approach, which looks at the damage that is in the organism and how to remove or reverse it, which is a much simpler task than comprehensively understanding how that damage comes about. And this approach, I think, is what transformed how the biogerontology community viewed aging and the prospects of its reversal during the past 2 decades. So really, I think Aubrey de Grey needs to be recognized for his contribution to this change in perception. It is through tireless activism and advocacy that he brought this about. And I hope that everybody in our movement is going to support him going forward, because he definitely needs to continue playing a crucial role in the advocacy phase leading up to this inflection point that he describes, to get people to understand what these technologies are going to be, when and how they're likely to come about, and what the effects are likely to be. So not an immortality pill, but a series of periodic rejuvenation treatments that people would undergo that would become increasingly better and more reliable over time. Now, Alexandria asks, Eric, whether you were able to watch the recent ARDD conference, that stands for Aging Research and Drug Development. There was a virtual option to watch it, whereas the in-person conference was held in Copenhagen at the start of September. Alexandria says that watching the presentations at this conference led her to realize how little she knows about the mechanisms of aging. She knows slightly more now, but she knows a lot more about what we don't know. So Alexandria, if you would like to share more of your impressions of that conference, just for the benefit of the audience, and then we'll get Eric's thoughts.
It was awesome. I couldn't catch the whole thing. I don't know why Alex Zoronikov gave me a ticket. I was not worthy, but I did pick up a few tidbits. I mentioned in our panel with David Goebel last week. One is that aging is a host of diseases, much like cancer is. It's not one, like I mentioned you got Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's, are totally different diseases, but aging is also a host of diseases that impact each other. That's one thing. And I'll put a link in the officer chat. I haven't had a look at the paper yet, but this research was mentioned there that SLC 25A 51 is key to NAD absorption in cells. So there's one of our puzzle pieces. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, Eric, any thoughts on the ARDD conference? Were you able to watch it or at least be aware of what went on there?
I didn't see it. I haven't really been keeping up with a lot of stuff lately. I don't know. I go in, probably pick back up at some point, but I didn't. Sounds interesting. I didn't see it.
Yes, indeed. Well, hopefully some of the videos from that conference will be published over time, and then they could be revisited. Definitely a lot of great presentations from the researchers who are on the front lines. And I was able to catch perhaps half of the presentations, and I enjoyed the ones that I was able to see. Now, I also shared the...
It's going to be a few months.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a few months before they publish, and not all the presenters want to publish. But anyway, check out that paper I sent you and see how you think that might play with other therapies we know of.
Mm-hmm. And I posted the link to the paper in the YouTube chat. It's called MCART1/SLC 25A51 is required for mitochondrial NAD transport. So anybody who's interested in this paper, please check it out and let us know what your impressions are. And then I'd like to bring up a point that was made by Jason Geringer. He says, it's hard for me to say what would convince people. I think maybe understanding the basic science of it and explaining that science at a third grade level. And I'll relate a personal story. When I found out about SENS in 2004, I had just completed the advanced placement biology course in high school. And that was fairly rigorous, at least for a high school class. It prepared students for the AP exams, and it was a comprehensive survey of various subdisciplines in biology, but definitely I learned enough about human cells, the human metabolism, the aging process, that I could follow Aubrey de Grey's writings about the SENS approach. And I could see, based on what I learned in AP biology, that everything he wrote made complete sense from the contemporary understanding of the science. There was nothing there that was contrary to the established mainstream science that was taught in classrooms from the textbooks. He was using many of the same concepts. He was just looking at them in a different way, not just a theoretical way of, well, how does this process work, but from the standpoint of how can we introduce interventions that undo the damage and rejuvenate the organism. So for me, having that scientific background, that really helped me with understanding the SENS approach and grasping how realizable it is within our lifetimes. what would you say, Jason, would be needed to get most people to that point where they're conversant enough with the science that they could say, yes, this is realistic, this makes sense, this isn't just wishful thinking, it is scientifically supported?
Well, basic biology, a lot of times, putting it in a third grade level is sometimes like really important. That's why I said third grade, because, that, which is sometimes very difficult to take something that's rather complicated and make it simple, and I think that would be very good thing for us to do here, is try to see if we can take the basic science of it and just get it as simple as we can, to explain it. Because honestly, if someone was to ask me right now, I couldn't explain it, to be honest with you. So I know I myself don't even have a good enough understanding, And I think that's kind of key, really, because I mean, for me to believe it, I'd have to have a good understanding of, the science behind it. And I made it as far as, college biology 1, but there was some of what Aubrey was saying that was still above my head. So I think I'm probably not alone in being able to benefit from, a nice, simple explanation of the science, So back to you.
Yes, and this is a worthwhile question to explore. Alan Crowley, whom we would like to thank for his generous super chat as well, says, simplify, simplify, simplify. Getting the science down to the lowest possible level is important. I would also like to thank Ginger Peterson for her very generous super chat. We really appreciate it. And now I'd like to turn it over to Eric with regard to any thoughts you might have about how we can improve scientific literacy to the point where more people are going to understand the basic science behind SENS and evaluate it for themselves. So it's not just somebody's say-so or based on wishful thinking, it's based on a rational evaluation of the evidence, at least from an intelligent layperson's perspective.
Well, another great topic. A lot of people, I think it comes down to that our early adopters are more likely to be biology minded and whatnot. And like when you say things like, we should, or when you put out a simple message, or when you put out a meme, especially, and it's not widespread, but you hear it often enough. You hear people saying things like, memes are the drudges of society. Memes are for stupid people. Well, yeah, stupid memes are for stupid people, but gateway memes to important causes are indispensable, I think, in a world of social media where, we're all right here in this one place. It's just like kind of simple messages about everything under the sun, except for the one thing that everybody should be focusing on, And people don't just not think about life extension and then one day see an article about it and then just sit down from their soccer life and read a life extension article. They usually need some prodding, maybe a mention from a relative, or they saw it on the news, or they saw a meme with a link or something, And the meme leads to the article, and the article leads to, the conference tickets, and the conference tickets lead to yearly donations and so forth, and everything else. Telling their kids that maybe they should consider going to school for that, or whatever. So, I mean, I could go on and on for that, but basically, I think it really boils down to a big, good, poignant meme and infographic campaign.
Yes, indeed. And I do think it's important to communicate these ideas in concise, easily distillable messages. Great Point says, if you can't explain it to a kid, you don't know it well enough. And interestingly enough, I wrote the thus far only illustrated children's book on indefinite life extension, Death is Wrong, where I attempted that very explanation. Now, that book was published in 2013. I believe it needs updating. Hopefully, I can work on an updated version later this year with information about advances in the science since the start of the last decade, as well as more illustrations, more examples of long-lived animals, more support for the idea of indefinite life extension from some of the greatest thinkers in history. But I agree, kids need to be brought on board and recognize these possibilities. And of course, Mile played a crucial role in helping to promote Death is Wrong back in 2014 when we held the fundraiser to make the book available to over 1,000 kids in 14 countries throughout the world. So explaining this to children, I think, is critical, and that kind of simple explanation can resonate with adults as well. I've had many adult readers or teenage readers who expressed admiration for Death is Wrong and who found the book to be inspiring. And Great Point also says animations help. That's correct. There is a great animated video of Nick Bostrom's Fable of the Dragon Tyrant, which has millions of views on YouTube. So that was definitely quite a popular way of communicating the life extension message. Mike Lazine also favorably mentions Death is Wrong and says we need people like Gennady to write books on SENS and other transhumanist subjects. Thank you for the suggestion. I will certainly be working on that kind of literature in the coming years. And Jason Mallory says, science and medicine hide behind jargon. Communication beats jargon with me. So it is true in many scientific fields and many technical fields generally, a kind of specialized language emerges, which may make it easier to communicate certain ideas among insiders, but people in the public don't necessarily grasp those ideas right away. And if the language becomes too esoteric for them, they just won't understand what the scientists are talking about. So we need more communicators to provide that bridge between the scientists and the lay people who might have the cognitive capacity to understand those ideas, but they need the ideas presented in everyday language. Then John H. says, I find myself curious as to why there aren't more very deep pockets types involved in transhumanism and radical life extension, because if there's one thing we can be sure they love, it's their own selves. And maybe that's changing now with Jeff Bezos and Yuri Milner getting into the field, investing in Altos Labs. This is, of course, very preliminary. The Google founders, of course, have been investing in Calico since 2013, though Calico has been focused more on the fundamental research into the biology of aging rather than applications for how to reverse aging. And then Alan Crowley says, the ideas of transhumanism spring from the essential quality of humanity and support human flourishing. Clarifying these foundational ideas helps build cohesion around a political party. And I completely agree that is what we try to do within the US Transhumanist Party. So Eric, I'm curious as to your thoughts about whether you think indeed more people of means are coming on board with this movement, and what you think it would take to make this the cause that every billionaire stands behind and is willing to devote significant resources to.
Yeah, over the years, now there's too many big dollar investors to even count. I guess that could still be considered a small amount, even if it is, let's say 100. I don't know. I wonder how many there have been. That's a good question, but more than 20, which there must certainly be. Seems like we're kind of rolling well in that way, at least to start out. We're not, not moving forward in that area. And what was the other part of the question? You said in order to get more to start investing, in order to get more to start investing, I think you either need the proverbial robust mouth rejuvenation or breakthroughs, or a lot more grassroots efforts. And a lot of people see the big names like Ardd and Zoltan, and they think, well, why would you want to do a lot of little projects when they're taking off such big swaths and just a few media appearances? But I mean, we need more. We need more of them. Just two of them seems like they're covering a lot of ground, but they're really not. It's a big world, and so basically, I think we need to prop up more grassroots projects with funds. But as you know, the funds really have a very heavy lean towards the research. People are much more prone to donate to research than promotion, which good for research, but I think there's a big amount of progress that grassroots is set to accomplish if it can get the research. It would be a shame if it never did. I mean, of course, I want money for projects, but even if I don't get money for projects, just any inflow for small scale stuff would be a big step, and I would be very excited to join in making it happen.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the field right now, a lot of projects that could materialize with a little bit of funding, but even more so, a little bit more manpower, because much of the work at this stage can still be done with volunteers who have enough time to devote to the project. And of course, in a time of national emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic, sometimes spare time is very difficult to come by, and I understand, but I still encourage as many people as possible to volunteer for the movement for indefinite life extension, for the Transhumanist Party, whether you have a lot of money or little money. If you have time, that time can sometimes be the most precious commodity and resource that you can offer to the movement. I will also point out that people like Aubrey de Grey and Zoltan Istvan started out very much as ordinary individuals seeking to make a difference in this movement. Zoltan was a journalist covering conflict zones, and he nearly stepped on a landmine in Vietnam in 2003. And when his life was narrowly saved by his guide, he realized what a tragedy and a travesty death is. And he sought for a long time to figure out what he could do to make a difference. And that eventually led to the transhumanist wager. It led to him founding the Transhumanist Party, running for president, having the Immortality Bus tour, and greatly increasing the media exposure of the movement. Then Aubrey de Grey, he didn't start out as a biogerontologist. He started out as a computer programmer working on AI and also working as an IT administrator at Cambridge University. It was when he delved into biology as an amateur that he realized a lot of the establishment biologists weren't really interested in the problem of solving aging. They were just interested in studying aging from a theoretical perspective. So he realized that he personally had to make the difference in getting this field to where it is right now. So both of these were essentially ordinary people with extraordinary motivation. Another such person is Liz Parrish. Liz Parrish got into the field because her son had type 1 diabetes, and she experienced all of the suboptimalities of the healthcare system. And she realized that the healthcare system wasn't really serving patients with chronic conditions. And the vast majority of those patients' chronic conditions were, of course, caused by biological aging. So she began to be very interested in gene therapies and ways of alleviating this kind of suffering, especially the suffering caused by aging. So every one of us who is active in this movement has an origin story along these lines. Most of us did not start out as experts in the field. Most of us started out as ordinary individuals seeking to make a difference. And this movement is quite welcoming of that. And it's going to reward people based on the time and effort that they put in. John H. also points out in the chat that Andrew Steele had a similar start to Aubrey's computers first, biology second, and that is quite an apt observation as well. So Eric, I'm curious what your recommendations would be for people who want to get started in this movement. What are some easy ways to delve into the movement and begin making positive contributions?
Well, that maybe you remember that's the third point in the three things I like to focus on. Why they should think life is great, why they should think it's feasible. And then the third point I like to try to focus on more than everything else is telling people what they can do to get involved. And, the best thing I think is to just find these grassroots projects and these research fundraisers, which basically are grassroots projects. I mean, we're not coming from big research or something. And, seek them out without giving up. A lot of people just like Google for 2 minutes and, there's something there for everybody. There's lots of organizations. Every time I go to an organization and I click on their, about page or whatever, there's a thing that says, we need graphic designers, we need outreach person, we need angel investors, of course. But, that's kind of hard to convey to people, and people don't really get excited about that suggestion when you give it to them, because it's kind of a big step unless the person is really about ready to get involved, But that's why I try to focus on just the simple things. Like it seems, too simple, but I think if we just keep reminding people, we have to share this stuff. We have to like it. We have to, encourage the people, if they post, for a new conference, don't just let it go with no likes. Say something encouraging about it or whatever. And all those little things I think that we do, spreading it around and giving it a dialogue, draws the circles that are around us in, and leads to the bigger things. Leads to them looking into organizations that need help. Leads them to other people who might be able to tell them about what student opportunities there might be or whatever.
Yes, indeed. And Luis Arroyo writes, activism, content creation, and debating, proposing transhumanist and futurist solutions to issues would be interesting to see from the USTP's point of view. And indeed, we focus on these. We encourage our members to create this kind of content. Luis himself created some excellent graphics under the title, What is Transhumanism? If you go to our website right now, they are at the top of the site, and I will link to those graphics in the YouTube chat as well. When you were talking about memes, Eric, of course, we would want our memes or infographics to be higher caliber than most of what circulates on various social media sites. We don't want the white blocky text joke memes that originate on Reddit. We want something more thoughtful, more artistic, something visually of high quality, and of course intellectually of high quality. And maybe the thoughts themselves can be bite-sized, a sentence, a paragraph at most, some good graphics, but they have to be of a kind of upward aspiring character. So we want to inspire people. We want to get them to see the possibilities. We want them to take their thinking to the next level. It's not cheap entertainment the way that many memes are, unfortunately, these days. But I wonder, do you have any advice on how to create effective graphics for posting on social media?
Well, I'm sure you're talking to me, right?
Yes.
Well, I'm sure there's better ways to do this. I've looked into the people who do that for a living, but they're kind of expensive. I think the best way is just to pay the whatever it is, $100 or something for an iStock account. And if you're like, I'm not a good editor, so I would hire a good editor. Have somebody good at editing on hand, and have a little team that kind of make sure that everything looks right. And you do it without much trouble. I think just 2 or 3 people, a small budget of just a few $1,000s could probably. And that's just one. I think there should be multiple little teams of 3 people putting out good series of infographics and memes for various organizations and so forth. Like, there's some places that already have decent ones. And yeah, of course, not the crappy ones, obviously. So on the other hand, maybe if you find an opportunity in a certain demographic, overall, you got to fit your message to the demographic at hand. I'm not saying we should go and target illiterate homeless people or something, but
Yes, thank you for those recommendations. Alan Crowley also writes that the London Futurists are an organization that does a good job of communicating the USTP's values, even if it is from a more global point of view. And I agree completely. David Wood runs the London Futurists. He has fascinating discussions with guests on essentially a weekly basis. And he has also been a strong supporter of the US Transhumanist Party. If you want thoughtful intellectual conversations about various future possibilities in many fields, please check out the London Futurists channel. It is a home for the kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that we want to foster as well. So now I would invite our panelists to ask Eric any questions that they have for him based on our conversation thus far, or anything else they want to bring up. Let's start with Art Ramon.
Not so much a question, more just a continuation of my previous statement. I think veterans might be key to helping get acceptance by some of the more conservative population who might oppose anti-aging. So that's what I see. If you have people in Space Force who've been given a lot of anti-aging longevity treatment to go on deep space exploration, when they come back and they're 100 years old but they look like they're 30. I think people who see that as a real world example, especially conservative people who support the military, they're going to see that and they'll start to accept longevity treatment. And yeah, that's what I see. Veterans are the key. Even if wounded veterans who have cybernetic appendages and brain implants to help them with their wounds, also will be real world examples that would help the populace at large start to accept a lot of the transhuman technologies that are going to come.
Yes, indeed. So, Eric, any thoughts about this pathway as an inroad to longevity for the larger population, the prospect of getting veterans to the point where they're rejuvenated and biologically younger, and that serves as a kind of signal to the rest of the public that this is possible?
I could see where that I would start exploring that and probably come to some conclusions about why that's a great idea. But I don't see the specific. What it reminds me of is the older crowd. We do need to you know, they are notoriously harder to crack, you know, the 50 to 80-year-olds. And they might have some angles like that. Yeah, I mean, you know, if you give them an angle like you really want your veterans to remain Maine for the remaining years, then you know, that might be a way to get people to accept it more without arguing, because nobody wants to stand there and argue that, you know, regenerative medicine shouldn't proceed faster because veterans don't need arms or whatever, you know.
All right, thank you to Eric. And now let's go to Ben Ballweg. Any questions or comments for Eric?
Eric, I guess I kind of asked earlier about what were the scientific findings that you were finding most provocative for sharing with the public in general. I suppose another one that I would have is, I don't know if you'd want to run with the thought of many people making small comments and such, and pushing the agenda in general is better than maybe a few people that are like devoting their lives to it all the time. Maybe I wanted to get a little more into, I think somewheres in our presentation preparation, we saw that you've been working on this full time for at least the last decade, and maybe the last couple decades even. I guess I want to have a little more concrete idea of what you have been doing, because I feel like I am supposed to be doing pretty much exactly what you have been doing, and I want to be doing my job better. So what have you been doing the last decade, and how should I be, not how should I be changing what I'm doing, but maybe you share yours and then I'll get a better idea of what I should be doing.
So Eric, I believe you're on mute.
Yeah, that reminds me of the notion that when I first got to the Immortality Institute, I was excited, and I thought there must be somebody around here who can tell me where some volunteer opportunities and maybe jobs, and I thought there was going to be lots of ways to get involved, and that I just needed to see a list that they had somewhere. And you know, over the years, I realized that nobody has a list, and it seems like such a shame that, you know, people are coming in and looking for things to do and not finding it. So I decided, well, I have to do that. And it's kind of one of the first things that I did, and it's a big deal, I guess, that you need that to happen. But overall, I mean, to answer your question, you know, I have a resume of everything that I've done over the years in a Google Doc. I mean, it's just all small stuff, so it's kind of hard to encapsulate, you know, but it's basically random projects, you know, outreach here, book distribution there, you know, and trying to find that next thing that you think is going to go viral or, you know, be effective in whatever extent. Of course, you're always looking for that proverbial purple cow. And that's going to, you know, turn heads. But all the little stuff, you know, is really adds up anyway. So I mean, it's not like, and you know, like I had some things in mind for what I think should be done, but I can't remember them all. But you know, like one of the big ones is I think that we need to get on a grassroots level. And this level, we need to do things like for example, get another immortality bus rolling, you know, or two or three. You know, it doesn't have to be, you know, shaped like anything, or just shaped like a bus. But, you know, we just need to fund people to tour around, give lectures, give out books. You know, send them to whatever relevant conventions, or, you know, and especially I think there's a big market there for sending people to related conventions. You know, like a regenerative medicine gathering or whatever, or an activist gathering, go and give away books and pamphlets. Basically just small think and done projects until you can generate any sort of income to make it bigger. Part of that is, if you can get successful projects going and you can get 10 or 20 life extensionists around who are probably going to help out with stuff, then it just makes everything easier. Then you can pool your money. Everybody puts in $100 and does this thing or whatever.
Yes, thank you for those answers, Eric. I do agree that it helps to get people focused on projects which are fairly easy to implement, where they can make incremental progress, and that helps jumpstart the movement, get it to the next level. Now, Jason, you had a question. You were asking for any advice about getting aging classified as a disease. You say it's semantics, but it kind of matters. I'm curious, Eric, regarding your perspective on this. What are some effective ways of getting aging classified as a disease? And do you think that's an important step to advance our movement and the public's recognition of the importance of this fight?
I think it's an important step. I see the value in it too. But when I stand back and put in a list of priorities in my head, like over the years, I thought, well, like me personally, I would rather put it off. So we've got like more resources and people collected and whatnot. But I've seen people, small groups have been making moderate successes with that issue. And every time I see that progress being made, it just makes me think, well, it probably is a much more awareness generating project than I thought it was to begin with. Because not only are you changing, making progress towards changing laws, even if you're just having conversations with policymakers and not really, at least you're influencing their thinking process, and also in the process, they're just raising the profile of the success that life extension activism can have. It's pretty, it's a convincing point when you tell people, like there has already been advances on that issue.
Yes, and the U.S. Transhumanist Party has been trying now for about a year and a half actually, to get aging classified as a disease somewhere in the world, in some country or city, whichever jurisdiction will be the first to make that designation, I think is going to set off a domino effect, both in terms of publicity and in terms of getting other jurisdictions interested in making similar declarations. Jason, it seems that you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, could somebody clear up why exactly, I got a pretty good idea, but a little more clarity would be cool. Why exactly we want it classified as a disease? Is it because then it is able to go through get funding from government research because they won't fund it if it's not a disease, or what is, because it's not that we really want it to be classified as a disease, as far as I know. It's that it has to do with getting the research funding, I believe, isn't it?
Well, the issue is, while the US federal government does fund research on aging via the National Institute of Aging, in order to get a drug or medical device or treatment approved by the FDA, there need to be some specific disease indications that that treatment works on and alleviates. And if aging is not considered a disease, then a treatment whose primary benefit is to slow down or reverse aging just doesn't have a basis for the FDA to approve it. And thus far, researchers have had to devise workarounds, like say, we're targeting a specific degenerative condition, and it could even be a condition that doesn't really relate to aging per se, but their drug or other treatment they're working on could also address that condition and alleviate some of its symptoms or reverse it. But that creates a challenge for researchers because then they can only focus on drugs and devices and treatments that have those other effects on other specific conditions that are recognized as diseases. And that narrows the universe of possibilities for what the FDA could even potentially approve. So if something works on aging but doesn't work on some very specific condition, it wouldn't have a means to go through the FDA trials right now, unfortunately.
I wonder if you just listed all of them. You know, what disease are you working on? All of them. Give me a big piece of paper. We're working on them all.
Well, the FDA would then want you to run clinical trials that show some efficacy in addressing all of the diseases one listed. And the problem with that would be it would take hundreds of years and many, many billions of dollars to do that, which is why working on aging as a disease is desirable, at least from the standpoint of streamlining the system. Now, Ben says his understanding from David Goebel in last week's virtual Enlightenment Salon is that in the Methuselah Foundation, they push for treatments for orphan diseases and then spread those treatments to more diseases and finally go as far as aging in general. And that is indeed one of the tactics used. It's not that nothing that affects aging can be approved. Indeed, there are strong hypotheses that existing drugs like metformin may affect biological aging to a certain extent. But this approach does take more time. Now, Eric, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. If we figured out a way to get regulatory agencies like the FDA to recognize potential treatments that directly target aging without going through this roundabout pathway of identifying specific diseases, would this help accelerate the progress of this technology and making it as widely available to people as possible?
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess it would have to. I mean, and you know, back in the day, the FDA used to be a much bigger topic. You know, they were like the enemy. I guess maybe they still are, but there's been all these things that they've been doing over the last 5 years, maybe, that seem to be a softening of their stances. And you know, that's another example of the small things we can do. I think, you know, like there's so many diverse small projects that I work on. Like I said, it's hard to encapsulate them sometimes, but that's one of them. Me and Daryl Wolf, I think, we got together and you know, put together a letter, and we sent it off to different people. I think we sent one letter to Donald Trump, trying to get him to consider our person of choice for the FDA. You know, it's a long shot, but it's like, you know, if we all do those little things, you know, it might get into their head. And if, I mean, it's very possible that we could get a person of our choice into a high position in the FDA if we put enough effort into it, you know. And you know, I mean, it's good. I mean, we need not only cooperation from agencies like that, which would be a big help, of course, but we need this to become a life extension world. And that might seem a little bit far off, but you know, I don't think it is. It's probably going to just change suddenly one day when winds of mainstream media catch it, right? You know?
Yes, and that's the inflection point that Aubrey de Grey was discussing. I do think we have an important role in bringing this about, just in persevering in our activism, in our promotion of these ideas, and trying to bring new people into the movement. And this may seem like a gradual, painstaking effort at times, but the payoff can be great once the tide turns in terms of getting the public to recognize the feasibility and desirability of these advances that we have been discussing now for decades. Howard Druin has a few comments. He writes, I read The Immortalist by Alan Harrington when I was 12. It was written in 1968 or 1969. It was well written and engaging. It needs a revision and update, although the author died. Yes, Alan Harrington, I believe, died in 1997, and he unfortunately did not live to see the advent of indefinite life extension. He was 79. He died of leukemia, but he was quite inspiring in The Immortalist. Indeed, there is a quotation in Death is Wrong from Alan Harrington that resonated with me greatly, and I know it resonated with you, Eric, because you featured it as well. And this is the quotation where Alan Harrington says, we must never forget that we are cosmic revolutionaries, not stooges conscripted to advance a natural order that kills everybody. So this idea that we are cosmic revolutionaries is one that ought to inspire many people. This is a view of ourselves as active agents in the future of our species, indeed, in the future of the universe. We're here not to adhere to the natural order that kills everybody, but create a better order, a more humane order. Indeed, I like to say the words human and humane are related. That is what we can bring to the universe. But of course, we need to work for it, and we need to live a lot longer than we do currently in order to succeed at that quest. So, Eric, I know you were inspired by Alan Harrington as well. Any thoughts on his writings and his quotation?
Yeah, it's great. Well, the comment I have on that is I wrote a modified book review of sorts. I don't know what you call it. Really. It's a long essay about that book, and it's one of the best things I think I ever wrote. That's a very, because basically it was kind of like having a conversation with Alan Harrington, and that's a good book, and it puts forward a lot of this stuff in a urgent and lively way, I guess.
Yes, and I believe the article you refer to is your piece from 2010 called A Response to the Compression of Morbidity Mindset, correct? Oh,
that was one of my earlier ones that I thought was pretty great. But this one I think I wrote a couple years ago. So it's called The Philosophy of Immortality, something Alan Harrington.
All right, well, I encourage people to check this out, The Philosophy of Immortality by Eric Schulke. And I would like to bring up another point made by Howard Druin. He says that so far nothing has been said about the pandemic as an opportunity to advance biomedical research, as well as creating the political will for supporting such research and the problems with Luddites. So on the pandemic, of course, we have been discussing this since March of 2020, how COVID-19 disproportionately affects people who are biologically older, people who have pre-existing conditions, various degenerative diseases that compromise their immunity. And this should have been a wake-up call for the world in terms of the imperative to devote additional resources to the fight against biological aging, because if we had all been biologically young at the onset of the pandemic, some of us would still have been vulnerable to COVID-19, but the death toll, the number of severe hospitalizations would not have been nearly as extreme as it ended up being. And so we might not have had a pandemic, we would have just had another disease that came up and was affecting some people, but the public health systems would have dealt with it quite effectively. And one would think, especially given the statistics that have been published and circulated quite widely, that people would make this connection between COVID-19 and aging. But unfortunately, we haven't really seen that affecting the thinking of policymakers. So, Eric, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to get people to see that connection and see why reversing aging is a crucial component in the fight against infectious diseases like COVID-19.
In this past year, I've thought about how I should think about that, because that's an interesting subject, but I don't think I really ever got around to thinking about it. I guess, I think there's connections to be made there. I think there's some things that we should have capitalized on during the pandemic that we didn't, but I don't recall what I had in mind when I thought that.
All right, well, hopefully we can get more discussions to proceed on this, because the pandemic is still ongoing, and I think it continues to be an important question of how do we leverage what is widely known about COVID-19 and make the connection in people's minds with the fight against aging. So another part of Howard's question is the problems with Luddites, people who are explicitly opposed to technological progress, who think that technology is bad and should be resisted in some way. What are some ideas that you have about, one, whether Luddites are really a large problem right now or a more minor problem, and two, how to deal with Luddites, how to address the challenges and criticisms that they pose?
Talking to me, right?
Yes.
Well, I think I go over that in that guide too, and I think I say something to the effect of basically just leave them alone and don't even try to engage them, because they don't seem to be very large in number, and just all the successes I think will just kind of change their minds, not all their minds, but some of them along the way, or just make them marginal and irrelevant. There's always going to be some holdout for everything. I mean, there's still people that don't use medicine or telephones now, and also they're valuable. I think we do need a certain amount of them. I think we kind of we don't want to have none, I think, because even though I say avoid them, I think there are certain times when you do want to engage them. Like if you were at a conference and like some Luddite was heckling you and you had a chance to invite them up to debate live on stage, that could probably be a pretty compelling thing, as long as it's in a certain condition, where there's not like a whole bunch of them where they can back each other up. And I don't know, there's just different scenarios where things like that are a good idea or a bad idea. Depends.
Yes, thank you for those thoughts, Eric. And it seems that you don't consider Luddites to be the foremost problem. That is, the greatest source of resistance isn't from people who are opposed to technology as such. It's more from people with a status quo bias who don't see life extension in particular as feasible or desirable. But those same people may be embracing a wide range of other technologies, and they're not opposed to smartphones or computers or open heart surgery. So it would be possible perhaps to bring them on board by illustrating that they've already bought into the premise of technological progress, and this additional step of indefinite life extension isn't really a dramatic shift from what they already embrace. It just offers them new possibilities, new opportunities. In terms of actual Luddites, I would say there's a difference between people who just choose not to adopt certain technologies like the Amish, and that's their right to do. And in a future society, in a future transhumanist world, people like that will be allowed to live whatever lives they choose, adopting or not adopting whatever technologies they desire. At the same time, of course, the actual historical Luddites, they aggressively destroyed textile machinery because they thought that this would displace manual workers. So we clearly don't want people like that who attack the infrastructure of our civilization, who destroy examples of technologies. And people like Ted Kaczynski come to mind in this regard. But I do agree that thus far, those people are fairly rare. I am concerned about the increasing calls for degrowth in the media. And those calls are linked, in my view, to some very misguided responses to climate change. The Transhumanist Party, of course, takes the position that climate change is a real problem and it needs to be addressed and it needs to be reversed. But this can only be done through further technological progress, through more innovation, through an improvement to our quality of life that comes about, for instance, through cheap, safe, reliable, clean energy, not by going backward, not by undoing the great progress that our civilization has made over the past several centuries in raising people's standards of living. So now I would like to ask if Celeste Castaldo has any questions or comments for Eric.
Yes. So, well, Eric, I'm really impressed with the work you're doing, and I think it takes a lot of determination to move forward when we're in such a initial stage, I would call it, in the movement. And so I'm just trying to get some insight from you on how to bring people into the movement, and where you're doing, I don't know, any type of advertising or posting online articles, things like that, to attract members to the movement, because that's what I'm doing here for the Northern California liaison role for the party as well. And we support the type of work you're doing for sure.
Eric, I believe you're on mute.
I don't have too much going on right now. I'm just kind of looking for the next big project. I mean, I'm doing small stuff on the side. I'm mainly just reading and writing and sharing and doing a little stuff. But what was the main question? The main question is, how do we? What could you do to?
How are you attracting, members to join the movement?
Well, just continuing to think of small, good projects that people think will work, and executing them. But as we all know, I think one of the main obstacles is money. I don't even think you really need a lot. And it also helps because even though there's a lot of volunteers around, I don't know, maybe I'm just not a great charismatic leader or something, but it can be hard to get people to do what you want to do. It can be like herding cats. But if you got money and you pay somebody, sometimes I pay people, and then they do exactly what I say. It's amazing. And stuff gets done way faster. And so, my biggest piece of advice is to figure out a way to start a small fund and get people to contribute to it, and use that for small projects.
Yes, thank you for that response, Eric. And Jason asks a question: how can we connect on social media? Of course, there's the Mile page, which is linked to in the description of this video. I've also linked to it in the chat. I will post another link to it in the YouTube chat, but any other ways, Eric, that you could think of with regard to connecting on social media, not just with Mile, but facilitating connections among all longevity activists so that we can carry out projects in a more coordinated fashion.
Well, I mean, I've seen a lot of projects kind of pop up, and some of them, do something. Some of them just kind of dissipate because they realize they didn't have enough to get it going. But sorry, what was the direction we're going with this again? I'm losing my train of thought.
What's your preferred social media platform?
Facebook.
Facebook.
Now, this kind of reminds me of.
No, go ahead.
Facebook is the best place, and but this kind of reminds me of this thing this life extensionist I know is trying to get me to help set up a 24-hour video discussion. So basically be like a group, but just live video all the time. And I'm like, huh. I mean, I didn't think it was a great idea at first, but it's kind of wearing on me. And now that you asked this question, I think that kind of is maybe a good idea. It would have to be experimented with, but
I think Daniel Tweet out there in the audience would really be a pretty good person to help with that. Actually, he was kind of a good radio guy, and he's pretty good. Surprised he don't come on the salons. Actually, shout out to Daniel Tweed. Just saying.
Yes, Daniel has been a reliable ally of ours. He also ran for city council in Thousand Oaks, California. He received over 3,000 votes there. And he has been a frequent commentator in our chats for the virtual Enlightenment salons as well. He's also on Clubhouse. He is one of the people who runs the U.S. Transhumanist Party Club on Clubhouse. He says in the YouTube chat that he is an advocate of a 24/7 live stream channel. So if you want to collaborate with Daniel and set one of those up for longevity advocacy, feel free to do that. Maybe it will be a good way for activists to coordinate their initiatives, for people to come on and discuss issues. I probably myself would not be able to participate except on a very occasional basis in a continuous live stream. I just have a more formal disposition, so I like events that have an official beginning and end, like the virtual Enlightenment salons, but a more informal stream where people could jump on and discuss projects or possibilities may be interesting if we could make it happen from a logistical standpoint. And Dan Elton, our director of scholarship, is also in the YouTube chat. He suggests maybe having a room on Clubhouse, and he points out that Daniel has been on Clubhouse and helped him create the USTP Club on Clubhouse. And yes, Clubhouse is an interesting platform. It's audio only. It allows for these rooms, and I would encourage this to be pursued further. So now I am curious if Alexandria has questions or comments for Eric. Let's see.
Indeed. Yes, sorry. I was starting to type something else in chat, but let's see, where was I going with that? Yes, I mentioned in chat that Kent Kimish's project, Molecular Reality, is gamifying using a research tool, and they're gathering science data through this, and while everyone is learning more about biology. That's an interesting, but just to say, well, through crowdsource meta studies. Maybe we could combine research, like I mentioned there. We have the sense approach, and we all have 55 theses by Michael Rose. And what more do we know when we can combine those? Are there convergences? Are there divergences? And I think that we could use our community to dig into this pile of knowledge where we all learn more. We can all do more sense making on it, and maybe get to the point where we could explain it at a third grade level. But just getting our own heads around it and incrementally research. People that just want to say, if we just share this enough, it's going to get out there. But I think we all need a more fundamental understanding of what we're talking about. Like I felt like the stupidest person in the room at the Ardd conference, so to speak. But I learned a lot, but not enough. But I'm just saying together, we could incrementally do work. Now, I'm not sure what's the best platform to stay on a focus on this is. What kind of infrastructure do we need to make it seamless to work together and also avoid the pitfalls of a noisy room? And I don't like Clubhouse that much. There's zero privacy policy, zero. So there are other, well, we're on Zoom now, that's better. But things like Jitsi Meet is another way to conference. So we ought to shop around for the best tools we can find and figure out the best governance for it so it doesn't devolve to troll land, and find members can narrow in on that. I guess I'm done.
Yes, I think those are important points because in the course of our virtual Enlightenment salons, we've raised a lot of awareness, I think, of a variety of transhumanists and life extensionist pursuits. And also we have gathered an immense amount of knowledge from our guests, and we need to consider how can we best integrate that information into actionable projects, endeavors, ways of educating more of our members regarding what is really possible for this movement to accomplish, because I think there's a lot of possibility. There are a lot of projects underway right now. It would be great if we could integrate the knowledge and achievements from those projects and create this solid base for the further progress and advancement of our movement. The knowledge is certainly there, the talent is there, the will is there. It's just a lot of information to integrate. Eric, any thoughts on this?
Money. I think that all happens with this money. I think that's where we're kind of stuck. Maybe you guys have more money than I realize. Maybe you're getting thousands of dollars or more. I don't know, but I don't see the money flying around very much. I mean, you know, of course there's some, but not a lot. You know, it reminds me of reading about the civil rights movement, and now I don't remember the details precisely, but from what I remember, that you know these various organizations, the SCLC or whatever, and you know all those places, there was a variety of them, and they weren't really getting much done. And then I read that there was like a big windfall of money, and then everything started happening, and it was just them using that money on basically the kind of stuff that we would be using. You know?
Yes, and I agree.
Full chain might get us there, but I don't know where the money's coming from. So we've just got to put in the elbow grease.
Yes, at this stage, I agree that through crowdfunding initiatives or other small scale fundraising, the amount of money we could get, it would still be relatively minor. I use as references the kinds of crowdfunding projects that have been successful in the life extension space. And generally, the most successful ones, the ones that are organized by lifespan.io, have raised several tens of thousands of dollars. Some have broken the $100,000 barrier, but that's really the extent of the resources in the grassroots community. Of course, large scale donations from people of means can come into certain organizations like the Methuselah Foundation. With Dave Goebel last week, we discussed the donation that Vitalik Buterin made of 43% of the entire supply of the dog Elon Musk cryptocurrency. So it seems the crypto entrepreneurs have resources to devote to projects and organizations that they think are going to be really effective. But that's an entirely different scale of funding. And I really believe that for organizations like the Transhumanist Party, for instance, the ability to accept donations largely is only going to make a significant difference if we can get a donation of that caliber to jumpstart our activities in a variety of dimensions, like having full-time staff, having a headquarters, having far more advanced infrastructure than we do. And until that time, we could have a little bit of money here or there for hosting some meetings once the pandemic ends. It would be good to have some funds to hold in-person meetings somewhere and buy pizza for the attendees. That would be nice. Or create shirts or create Transhumanist Party pins, for instance. We can still do that as individuals with our own funds as well. It would be nice to have a little more to scale that, but really to make a difference on the national stage. I do think we need, for activism purposes, perhaps a few $1 million. Would you agree with that, Eric?
I mean, of course, it's nice to start off with large chunks. You'd like to get a $50,000 donation or something like that. Not only is the money good, but it's a lot easier because fundraising can be a very time-consuming and long-haul process. And but I think any amount is good, in my opinion. Because you just take the $10 and you turn it into 100 and so forth. If we could get a fund that raised $5,000 in the next year, that wouldn't be very much. So we would leverage that money, in strategic ways, like probably to try to raise more money the next year, for example.
Of course, fundraising itself is a large investment of time, and Alan Crowley suggests that having a full-time fundraising team would be the first goal. And probably there would need to be a plan about how to create that, how to implement it, and at what stage we actually shift to utilizing some of those funds. Right now, any of the funding that comes in goes to pay for expenses like hosting the US Transhumanist Party website, for instance. And that is a fairly minor expense. And I'm happy to pay for the rest of it out of pocket, as I have been doing. But if we get more serious amounts of funding, we would, of course, need to have a thorough plan for how to use that, how to manage it, essentially. So that's an important component of further growth, I would say. Also, it's important to avoid what I call the startup runway problem. So startups that begin with a certain initial amount of funds, maybe from angel investors or early venture capitalists, but they don't yet have a way of sustaining that revenue stream, of having regular income from their operations. Those startups are in a more difficult position actually than ones that can operate without any money, because if they become too dependent on that money and they're unable to raise additional investments quickly enough, then the money runs out. Then the startup may have a good idea, a business model that potentially could be implemented, but they don't have the resources to do it and they have to fold. That's why about 95% of startups fail. And we definitely don't want to be in that position as an organization, as an activist effort. So at least for the Transhumanist Party, I'm going to try to be very careful about whether and how we involve large amounts of funding, but I do think working on a plan for getting to that point would be wise, at least as a possibility to consider. So now I want to ask a question from Ginger Peterson, who, by the way, says that she would wear transhumanist merchandise. Well, I have some links that I will share with Ginger in the YouTube chat. But first, I want to direct her attention to your attention to her question or her comment, which expresses surprise that Generation Z doesn't support transhumanism more. So, Eric, what have been your observations on the extent to which Generation Z is involved in the movement or not involved in the movement? Have you had a lot of interactions with members of the younger generation? And could you perhaps give us an impression of what their thoughts are about life extension and transhumanism?
I think I just expected, I think I was overly confident that the new generations were going to be much more, susceptible to life extension, and not just life extension, but just futuristic stuff in general. I just thought everything he had been doing and just regenerative medicine and stem cell research in general and the state of technology, would just, that we would see a natural propensity for large, significant numbers of them to support this. But I haven't really noticed it, and I haven't really been paying too much attention, but I guess I think, I need to put more time into that subject myself. It's a good topic to dig into a little bit. Like you say, like everybody says, that the easiest people to get through to are young people. You got to catch them young before their neurons have, hardened into the dogmas that they've stumbled upon by happenstance.
Yes, indeed. And this was the motivation behind Death is Wrong. Interestingly enough, in 2013, I estimated that children ages 8 and above would be able to understand the message of the book and respond well to it, as well as some precocious younger children. But an 8-year-old in 2013 would be 16 now. So getting close to coming of age and being able to already form a very sophisticated intellectual worldview. I remember myself, even at 13 and 14, being able to engage with ideas at the same caliber as I do today. Really, the only difference between my mind then and my mind now is in terms of my superior diplomatic skills learned over the ensuing 2 decades of experience. But I think a lot of young people certainly have the intellectual aptitude to grasp the kinds of subjects that we're discussing, and they would be valuable contributors to the discussion as well. So I'm curious about the other panelists' thoughts about this. What have you seen in terms of Generation Z's engagement with transhumanism and life extension? And could there be more of it? Is there not enough of it right now? I still sometimes feel like I'm one of the younger people in the movement, but what are your impressions?
Okay, I'll pitch in. I think the younger kids, and I'm doing some work that is similar to gaming. So I do interact and speak with a lot of younger people who are into gaming and virtual reality right now. But the younger kids absolutely have a much more acceptance of new ideas. And I think most of them would say, oh yeah, definitely. They would want to live forever if they had that opportunity available to them right now and can see the possibilities of that happening, you know, and the young adults as well. So I think the younger generations absolutely are more on board with the transhumanist ideals than a lot of the older generations.
That's great news to hear. And if that enthusiasm, that receptiveness to indefinite longevity can be channeled into activism, whether it be in the sense of advocacy or in the sense of helping bring those technologies about through research and development and marketing of those technologies, that would be great. It would give me hope for the future. Now, does anyone else have impressions? I see Alexandria posted in our internal chat that every young generation feels they are immortal or think they will live fast and die young. Aging changes that outlook. Well, I may be an anomaly in this regard, in that I was keenly aware of death and my own vulnerability ever since I learned about human mortality. And I remember whenever I faced something in the world, some sort of environmental hazard or some sort of disease risk, I would think, well, could this have the potential of killing me? And if it could, then I would try very diligently to avoid it. That's why it was very easy to convince me never to smoke or never to drink alcohol, because I saw the connections with death. It was easy to convince me to be safe around certain objects like manhole covers in Minsk. They were actually sometimes not very firmly attached. And so I was told as a child, do not step on the manhole covers. You might fall in and then nobody would be able to rescue you. So I still avoid manhole covers to this day. But as a child, I definitely never thought of myself as immortal. And I never wanted to live fast or die young. But again, I don't know how typical this is. Alexandria, maybe you'd like to comment on that and what you've observed in terms of attitudes among young people.
I was just reflecting on what I said, that when you are young and you feel okay, you do feel immortal. And that our how we feel about how long we would want to live, I think is very much key to how our bodies feel. If you're healthy, yeah, you want to live longer. If you're not, well, how long am I going to live like this?
So it's interesting. Your point is that if somebody is in good condition, they just think, well, why not continue this indefinitely? But if somebody is suffering, they may have more of a limit to how much suffering they could tolerate. But wouldn't you say somebody who's suffering, whether it be from aging or some other degenerative condition or acute condition, that their main thought would be, how can I cure this? How can I alleviate this? How can I feel better? Because I think everybody remembers a time when they felt better, and wouldn't they want to go back to that?
If they even see any options. But when you don't, and the degeneration continues, and state the world's in, yeah, some days I struggle with a will to live. You know, it's only if things can get better am I going to get more interested.
And that, of course, is a very tragic predicament that affects a lot of people. Hopefully, in terms of cultivating the will to live, the transhumanist movement can do a lot of good in this regard by pointing out to people that whatever they're suffering through and struggling with, and I think we've all had our share of at least health alarms, there are solutions that may be attainable in the future, even if they're not quite there today. Because of the progress of science and technology, we stand a chance, whatever chronic conditions we may have or acute conditions from time to time. This doesn't need to be the ever-present reality. John H. says in his comments that Alexandria is exactly right, that his mother and aunt said in their late 70s and 80s that they were just sick of being sick. And he says health span is absolutely key. Alan Crowley says, I hope we get to a point where young people don't know what death is and face that problem. And indeed, for every child, eventually they learn about death, they learn about human mortality. And I remember very vividly what that experience is like. I think a lot of people try to put it out of their minds or soften the blow of learning about this. And I just always refused to do that. I saw that as the greatest problem of the human condition then when I initially learned about it. And I still see it as the greatest problem of the human condition right now. And therefore I see it as imperative for us to overcome it through our combined efforts, which is why activism and advocacy are so important, and the work that Mile is doing is so important as well. So I think this brings us to the point in our virtual Enlightenment Salon where I would like to ask Eric to offer his concluding remarks, both in terms of any impressions that you've had regarding this conversation, as well as anything else that you want to say, anything we didn't cover, anything you'd like to expand upon, or any suggestions that you would like to give to people about how to contact you, how to work with Mile, anything that you haven't mentioned in this regard yet.
Well, I could go in a lot of different directions with that, but I don't want to get too go down too many rabbit holes, I guess. You know, I didn't really want to talk about this because I don't think it's a strategic time to right now, because I haven't really developed it much. But I guess I'd hate to waste this opportunity. I would say the next thing that I'm looking to get myself involved with is doing exactly the fundraising thing I was talking about, collecting small donations from everybody, then giving it out to people. And I would encourage people to look out for that. I sat down and thought, what really is going to be the next thing that I can be involved with that has the kind of impact that I want to have, and that is capable of doing it. And I think that's the best place for me to be. Like somebody said earlier, one of the things you need is full-time fundraisers. And if I, really dig into this, that's probably one of the things that I'll be, is just doing nothing but exhaustive fundraising for this for the next year or so, until it collects some pennies.
Yes, so thank you for sharing that plan with us, and please keep us updated once you set up an infrastructure for fundraising and distribution to various projects. I think that would definitely be worthwhile to explore and to spread awareness of within our community. So now, before we conclude the Virtual Enlightenment Salon today, I want to emphasize another important activist initiative that anybody can take part in. And this is to support one of the leading figures in the longevity research and advocacy community, Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He needs our support at this time. I think his continued involvement in our movement his continued ability to do his work as a researcher and as a spokesperson are absolutely crucial to ensure that we get to longevity escape velocity within our lifetime. And the US Transhumanist Party in the coming week will be publishing a statement of support for Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Please be on the lookout for it at our website at transhumanist-party.org. It should be available there sometime before the next virtual Enlightenment Salon. And if you see that statement, please read it, please share it on social media, please like it. Please make sure that as many people as possible see this, because we strongly believe Dr. Aubrey de Grey is an upstanding person, a man of integrity, a man we need to further this mission of indefinite life extension. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to Eric Schulke for your remarks and insights today. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our viewers. And until next time, live long and prosper.